Okay, so today is we're going to talk about perfect competition, and I'm going to begin by refreshing your memory about and extending the basic pure trade equilibrium, talking about the existence of equilibrium in large economies a little bit. I'll then talk about introducing production into economies and comparative advantage, how trade aids production as well as consumption, and who wins and loses in international trade. I'll talk a little bit about comparative statics and stability and what's called the correspondence principle. And then I'll turn to the welfare theorems and their implications. And in particular, I'll try to challenge some of the traditional things you may have heard about the implications of the welfare theorems, why the first welfare theorem is not really pro-market, as you might have learned it, and why the second welfare theorem is actually much more consistent with the spirit of what happened under the Soviet Union than the United States or the West. And then I'll talk a little bit about the role of information and how that really is the crucial thing in distinguishing different social systems, and in particular about how information technology is changing the role of information. Okay. So, Tanner, do you remember why trade brought benefits in a simple exchange economy that you learned about last term?
Yeah, if people have different things, they have different things, different endowments, and if I have something that you want and you think that I want, then it would be very beneficial for us to trade.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the idea of trade in an endowment economy. So, if I have things that you value more, you have things that I value more, trade allows us to each have what we value the most. This was represented in a simple Edgeworth box where individuals have points at which their indifference curve are tangent. Any of those points would be Pareto-optimal, but the economy could easily start at a point that was in between two of those curves, and then they would want to trade back to somewhere that lies along that curve. Okay, so not only do we know that there are gains from trade, but also we know that any equilibrium in a trading economy is Pareto efficient, because at any equilibrium, people must both set their indifference curves between the two goods tangent to the price, and that's exactly what's required for us to get to one of these points that lies along the contract curve, that both people set their marginal rates of substitution between the two goods equal to one another. Right? So everyone sets these marginal rates of substitution equal to the ratio of the prices between the two goods. So really the role that the prices play in the economy is to get everyone to set these marginal rates of substitution equal, which, if you'll remember from when we did production theory, was exactly what the Lagrange multiplier was doing in the context of the producer problem. Yeah,
what does the
Wesley?
MRX stand for?
It is the marginal rate of substitution of x into y. It really should have been MRS, I think, but I'm not completely sure why I put MRS.
So is it like a marginal rate of exchange?
It's like how much on the margin I would give up of x in order to get a unit of y. What would be the maximum amount of x I would be willing to give up in order to get a unit of y on the margin? Okay, so individual's optimization leads to social optimization in this context, because every individual sets their marginal rate of substitution equal to the social marginal rate of substitution, which is given by the ratio of the prices. This is the invisible hand of the market at work. And in fact, any Pareto-efficient allocation, any of these points along the contract curve can be achieved by not interfering in any way in the final allocation, but just moving around the initial goods and then allowing people to bargain through trade back to this point. So that's called the second fundamental welfare theorem. And with production, what we're really going to do is just reiterate these same basic principles by incorporating production in. So the simplest possible production economy is called the Robinson Crusoe economy. And this is an island where the only thing to eat is coconuts. And every coconut can be produced with 1 unit of labor. And there's one individual or many individuals who are identical who can choose how much to work in order to buy coconuts, which they then consume. And their utility function, let's say, is just a Cobb-Douglas, which is given by the consumption of coconuts they have to some power, alpha, times 1 minus the amount of work they do, that is the amount of leisure they get, to some other power, 1 minus alpha. Now, the currency in this economy is arbitrary, right? We could scale everything up and down and it wouldn't make a difference. So let's just normalize the price of labor, the wage, to $1. So a firm can produce a coconut for 1 unit of labor, and the firms have constant returns to scale, and therefore supply is perfectly elastic. So the price must be equal to cost at a competitive equilibrium, right? And so the price of the coconuts is going to be perfectly elastic at $1. So the question is, Suel, what is the equilibrium in the market for coconuts going to be? We know its price is going to be $1. So then what is the consumer who can choose to buy coconuts for $1 and sell his labor for $1? What is he going to do?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So the consumer can sell his labor for $1.
Okay.
And we know that he can buy coconuts for $1.
Mm-hmm.
So what is he going to choose to do then, given his utility function?
The same amount of coconuts as leisure, so like split the two evenly.
Will he choose to have the same amount of each?
Like alpha and 1 minus alpha add to 1. He'll split them by proportion of the alpha. He'll choose like alpha coconuts and 1 minus alpha leisure.
Exactly. So let's go through that in more detail. Ming, can you derive his utility maximization, given that his budget constraint is that, this should be 1 times the number of coconuts
I,
equal to this times 1 minus L.
Wait, why isn't it I?
Sorry, this is L, not I. This is the amount of labor he does.
So it's the budget is 1 times.
Yeah, this is 1 times 1 minus L. Times L. 1 times L.
1 times L.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So do I?
You can do it on the board or wherever you want to do it.
Okay.
This is basically just to derive what Suhail just, said.
Just ask like a basic question. And then according to the Cobb-Douglas utility function, you have that if L equals to 1, that means the person won't get any kind of utility whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. So if they're working all day long, they're going to be incredibly depressed because they need to sleep, for example.
Okay, 1 unit. Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
I thought 1 was 1 unit. All right.
Yeah, this is they have 1 hour in the day, let's say, or 1 day. It's measured in units a day, not. This is the fraction of time they're working.
Oops. So you want the equilibrium in the market for coconuts, and by the welfare theorem that means it is where the marginal rate of substitution equals to the ratio of the prices. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know about manipulation.
No, it's just 1. because-
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. And this has to equal to the ratio of the prices. The prices of,
They're both equal to 1, right?
yeah. So, put here. 1/1, right?
Yep. And you
So-
know that the number of coconuts that he has
Yes.
is exactly the same as the L.
Yes.
So you get,
So I just substitute this as C?
yeah.
Okay.
No. So you want to collect all the C's on one side of the equation. So you add alpha, so you get C times 1 is equal to,
And I just moved it around and got this. Did I make a mistake?
You just undid what you did before.
Did I?
yeah. So you want to add C times alpha to both sides, right? So you isolate C, so you get C is equal to alpha, which I don't think is what I solved for here, which is funny. Let me make sure that I made the mistake and not you. Do you guys get alpha? C is equal to alpha? Oh, C over L is equal to alpha over 1 minus alpha, which is right. Okay, good. C over alpha is equal to 1 minus alpha. Well, alpha over 1 minus alpha, which is exactly what Ming got. So Ming, you're done for the day. Congratulations. Okay, so if each worker has 1 day, then the question is, what's the solution to Ming's equation? And I just gave it, but I'm going to let Evan give the answer. Evan,
It's right over there.
what is it?
It's C over 1 minus C equals alpha over 1.
No, but what is C equal to then?
Oh, C equals the amount of coconuts that it is.
Yeah, but what is the value of C that he's going to choose?
I'm sorry, could you ask?
What's the solution for C in this equation? I just said it before.
I'm sorry, I must have missed it.
Solve for C in this equation. It's really
solve
easy.
for C.
Yeah, what is C?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to go up to the board?
You don't even need to. Look at this. C over 1 minus C is equal to alpha over 1 minus alpha.
It's alpha.
It's alpha.
Yes. Ding, ding, ding. Yes, that's right. Okay. So, now question is Anubhav here?
I think you dropped that.
He dropped out. Okay. So if you did this without, like going through this whole market thing, and we just maximized utility, obviously this thing is going to have the same solution, because basically the way that we solved it was exactly by saying that you can just take the derivative of this guy with respect to L, and you get that, this whole thing divided by L times alpha has to be equal to this thing divided by 1 minus L times 1 minus alpha, and you get exactly the same ratio of L over 1 minus L is equal to alpha over 1 minus alpha, right? So that says that the social optimum is exactly equal to the equilibrium. And Julian, can you explain intuitively why that's the case?
Because everyone is, so it's just the marginal rate of substitution that you put up before. So everyone everyone is the same in this case.
Yeah.
So if everyone is doing what's best for themselves, then it's going to be what's best for everyone in this case, because everyone's the same.
Well, but what is the role of the production here playing? So, like, we saw from before that everyone set their marginal rates of substitution between goods equal to the ratio of prices. But what is the firm by setting the ratio of the price of wages to the price of labor equal to 1? What is it doing there?
So it's setting what the marginal rate of substitution
should be, but then it's determined by the wage rate.
So it's determined by the rate at which it can transform work into coconuts, right? Because that's the other way. So like one way that, like why do we need to set all the marginal rates of substitution equal to one another? It's because one way I can get an extra good is by having you have less of it, right? And so I need to set the rate at which you're willing to have less of it equal to the rate at which I'm willing to have more of it,
so
right?
Here we have to set the rate at which we have less of leisure equal to
Yeah.
the rate at which we have more of coconuts.
Exactly. And that's exactly what the firm does. So the rate of turning labor into coconuts is the price to wage ratio, and the firm always sets its ratio of price and wages to the marginal rate at which it can transform coconuts in labor into coconuts, right? And the consumer has a ratio of consumption to leisure value, and it sets it equal to the same, which is exactly what you would do if you were solving the problem in the centralized way, right? So now we can make the worker, imagine we had lots of workers that were like this. We could make some better off and some worse off by moving money around. But any redistribution can be accomplished by just moving money around. We don't actually need to change anything else in the economy in order to get people to be able to buy as much or as little as is possible. Okay, so the only problems can arise here when equilibrium fails to exist. And this can be a problem if supply or demand are discontinuous. So let me give you an example. Suppose that the demand is 1 minus 1/2 P. And suppose that there's a firm that can either produce 1 unit at or 0 units, and it can produce those at a cost of 1. So then it's pretty easy to see that there's no equilibrium, right? So let me just draw out a picture of this. So the demand curve looks like that. And the supply is either, looks like this, and then looks like this, right? So the demand is, like we talked about in the other class, cutting through the area where the supply has a gap. So what are we supposed to do exactly? Well, suppose that there are 100 consumers and firms like this, right? Well, then what could happen is that 50 of the consumers could 50 of the firms could produce the good, and 50 of the firms would choose not to produce the good. And then we would have an equilibrium at this point here. So rather than just having these 2 points here, as we got to 50 firms like that, we would be filling in the little grids in between, because that would be the fraction of firms that are producing, right? And at some point that's going to get filled in, so it's going to get closer and closer to the demand. And if you have, the right, if it turns out it's even, then it will exactly be able to hit that equilibrium point. Yeah, Austin?
This assumes divisibility of units then?
It doesn't. So in fact, that's exactly what was causing the problem here, is that the units were not divisible. But what solved that was having a lot of firms. So even, the normal things you learn assume divisibility of units, but you don't really need that. What you really need is that there's a lot of firms in the market. And and the thing is that it's not reasonable to assume perfect competition unless you have a lot of firms. And so I think it's a very reasonable way to solve these problems of existence is to assume that there's a large number of people. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to use these perfectly competitive ideas. Yeah, Dave?
So in this case, the supply curve would just be a horizontal line?
Well, it's going to get towards being a horizontal line as there's more and more firms.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Philip, do you have a question?
Well, I was just saying, so basically the implication is you can only produce whole coconut, but once you produce them, you can cut them in half and split them among consumers, right?
No. Well, no. We're assuming you can only produce or consume whole coconuts, but if there's enough people on the island, even if... sorry.
So,
Yes, you're right. That's exactly what I'm assuming. That's right, Philip. That's right. So even if you can only produce whole coconuts, but you can split them then among consumers, then people will eventually as long as there's a large number of people, you'll be able to satisfy demand because you'll be able to make enough 50 coconuts so that each one can have half of a coconut. That's the idea. Yeah, so.
Yeah, so if like P is 0.5, for example, like if you're only receiving 0.5 and it costs you to make one coconut for $1, then why would any firm, I mean, even if there are 100 firms or 1,000 firms, why would any of them produce at a loss? Yes. Like if
They wouldn't produce at a loss. They're only going to produce at a price of 1.
Okay.
And that's exactly that point. And if you had the inability to divide coconuts, you could end up with a similar thing. Imagine that consumers valued coconuts, a whole coconut at $2, but didn't value a partial coconut at all. Then you could have gaps in demand, but as there got to be more consumers, some of them would get the coconut for $2, some of them would get it not at all. So you would have a similar way of resolving that problem. So in general, anytime there's a problem of like non-divisibility, it can be solved by there being a large number of people. Because rather than dividing things within the person, you divide them across people. Some people getting it and some people not. Does that make sense? Okay.
So, I'm sorry, it still costs them $0 to produce it, right? Or it still costs them $1 now.
$1 to produce.
Or it says to produce 1 or 0?
No, they can produce either 1 or 0, and if they produce 1, it costs them $1.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, I think you just asked this, but,
Yep.
so price would have to be over $1 then, right, for firms to produce?
No, it would have to be equal to $1.
All right, yeah.
Yeah. At $1, firms are indifferent between producing and not producing. Okay. So when there's a large number of firms or consumers, there's always going to be an equilibrium. And the only problems for equilibrium existence really come from small numbers of consumers. But that's not a very interesting thing to study in the context of perfect competition. You should study that in the context of monopoly or oligopoly models. So you really don't need to worry about equilibrium existence. This is similar to what we did with uncertainty before. Uncertainty, as well as large numbers of people, can smooth out all these discontinuities and make things work nicely again. Okay. So, Florence, what does intuitively production, the possibility of production, add to the potential benefits from trade?
I'm sorry.
So we were talking earlier about the benefits when there's just consumption.
If you kind of know what people want, then you can kind of produce more or less to get more of what you want and also kind of get more trade.
Yeah, that's a good point. So production can be optimized to match the demands of consumers. There's another potential gain that comes from trade when there's production. Wesley?
Well, so some firms may have a comparative advantage in producing certain things over other things, and so they'll gain more by trading those things away after they produce them.
Yeah, exactly. So what Wesley's saying is that, with individuals consuming, what we basically said was that some people want certain things more than others. Under production, instead, we say some people are better at creating certain things than others are. And trade now allows us to take advantage of those differences in people's abilities and not just the differences in their tastes. Okay, so like an example of this is imagine that Brazil is really great at growing sugar. And so to create one computer, it costs them 1 ton of sugar. And imagine that China is really great at building computers and not so great at growing sugar. And it costs them 1/10 of a ton of sugar to build a computer, right? So then we say that China has a comparative advantage in creating computers, and Brazil has a comparative advantage in sugar, even if China is more productive at sugar as well as at computers overall, because all that really matters is which are they relatively better at creating. So even though China has an absolute advantage in both, Brazil has a comparative advantage in sugar. And regardless, both do better if they focus on their comparative advantage. Let me see if I can graph this up. No. Okay. Let me draw one. So this is computers and this is sugarcane. and Brazil can get 1 computer for 1 ton of sugarcane, so they have a production possibilities frontier like this. Now China can get 10 computers for 1 ton of sugarcane, but imagine they can produce more sugarcane than can Brazil, so they'll have a production possibilities set like this, right? But both of them could do better if Brazil produced all of the sugar. Because imagine they want, say, this much sugar in total. Well, then have Brazil produce all the sugar, and China produce all the computers, and they will be able to have. Okay, so if they tried to get to here, and imagine they each produced half of the sugar for that amount, then you would get this amount of computers plus this amount of computers, which would take us to there. On the other hand, if Brazil produces all the sugar and China produces all the computers, we get up to that much higher point up there. Because basically, for every unit of, if we're producing 1 unit of sugar, China had to give up 10 computers for that, whereas Brazil only had to give up 1 computer for that. And so, and that's more generally true regardless of the mix that they want. It's always best for the first units of sugar to be produced by Brazil, and China only to produce it if Brazil is no longer able to produce, right? So for example, if China can produce 100 China could produce 100 computers and Brazil could produce 8 tons, then together they could produce 80 computers and 10 tons, whereas alone, to get the same ratio, China would have to produce only 50 computers and 5 tons, and Brazil would produce 7 computers and 1 ton, which is much worse than what they can do together. And this is very analogous to what we said about pure consumption trade. Everyone produces what they're best at in the same way that in pure consumption trade, everyone consumes what they most want to consume. So being good at producing something is like enjoying consuming it. Okay. Now, imagine that there are 2 different groups of people living within these societies. We know overall the societies will be able to produce more. But imagine that, but the problem is that once they start trading, the prices for things are going to end up in between where the prices were before. So imagine that, for example, the price is 5 computers per 1 ton of sugar. Now the Chinese farmers who used to be able to get 10 computers for the 1 ton of sugar that they produced are going to only be able to get 5 tons, and they're going to be worse off, right? Yeah, Philip.
This price would be in the middle if and only if well, it could only be in the middle if Brazil was producing only sugar and China was producing only computers, right?
That sounds right, yeah. I mean, the problem is I made the technologies completely linear here. So if I made the technologies less linear, then it will always be in the middle. It's on one of the extremes here unless they're completely specialized. That's right. So then Chinese farm owners will have their price cut in half, while the Brazilian factory owners will be able to get only 1/5 as much sugar for each one of their computers. So the Brazilian farmers and the Chinese producers are going to benefit more than these guys lose. And so while there's an overall social gain, there's going to be a loss to the person who's producing the thing that's more scarce within their country. And that's called the Stolper-Samuelson's theorem. Now economists say, well, you could always compensate, you could always redistribute to the person who's harmed from the person who's benefited. But that can create problems as well. Imagine that you had a general policy that whenever anyone was harmed by trade, you would redistribute to them from the person who was benefited by trade. That would encourage everyone to seek protectionism just so that they could gain when then the protectionism was repealed, right? So in practice, we don't compensate people fully that way. And that in turn can lead to lobbying by the people who are the scarce factor to try to stop free trade. So in the United States, labor is scarce compared to most developing countries, and therefore it's usually the labor unions who are in favor of protectionism rather than businesses. And some people have used more generally this idea of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem to explain many political developments in history. So for example, in the UK in the 19th century, labor was quite abundant. There were lots of people. Capital was quite abundant. There were lots of machines, but land was very scarce. And as a result, you got an alliance between capital and labor against land, and that's why you had like the Liberal Party versus the Conservative Party in Britain in the 19th century. On the other hand, in Germany, land was quite scarce, and capital was pretty scarce, but labor was very abundant. And so you got an alliance of land and capital against labor, which is why you had these conflicts between the communists and the Nazi Party, or at least that's what, there's a famous history book arguing that. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you explain, like, when in the U.S. you see a lot of times in, like, the Conservative Republican Party, you get kind of the land, the farmers, those kind of people, and the capital, like businessmen, against labor and Democrat? Or is
Yeah, you could definitely view it that way. And there's this history professor political scientist from UCLA who likes using the Stolper-Samuelson theorem to think about a lot of politics those ways. And your Republicans tend to be pretty free trade, and yeah, so that's one way of thinking about it. Yeah, Austin.
So obviously, like these problems would be ameliorated with like lots of movement of labor and capital into the most productive industries. Are there any examples of times where that's shifted massively and thus you see changes along those lines?
Well, I think that so Avner Graef, who's a professor at Stanford, is writing a really interesting book about the Industrial Revolution, where he's trying to argue that like really this idea that it was quote unquote capitalism or free markets that made the Industrial Revolution happen is really confused. That what it was really about was like how well societies were able to like both give people welfare and help them to retrain for the new jobs, because countries that didn't do that had like revolutions or like gangs of marauding people who were unemployed, like causing chaos. And so like what really made the Industrial Revolution in England succeed was the ability to cushion those who were the losers from all the unemployment caused by the Industrial Revolution. So a classic story about comparative advantage is based on natural endowments. So for example, the China-Latin America trade or China-Africa trade is based on the fact that China has all these manufacturing goods and Latin America and Africa have lots of raw materials. The US-Latin America trade is based on the fact that there's certain, especially during certain seasons, fruits that can grow in Latin America that can't grow in the United States. But I think a lot of the gains from trade don't come from these natural endowments, but instead from the way that countries themselves choose to specialize themselves. So for example, Japan produces hardware much better than the United States does, and the US produces software. And it's not really obvious what natural endowment makes Japan better at hardware and what natural endowment makes US better at software. It's really just that there's a culture of producing hardware in Japan and a culture of producing software in the United States that's sort of grown up and gathered its own momentum. And it's probably good that we specialize, because each area is better than it would be if you had a mix of the two, because each area has gotten really good at what it does. So that's allowed for valuable trade, but there's not really any natural endowment driving that, right? Everyone gains by each group focusing on something. This can happen in cities as well. So one reason why cities form is that you have lots of people doing lots of different things, easily able to trade with one another, right? Everybody can be focused on one thing, but then they have the ability to exchange. And that's, what happens at universities as well. You can have people who are experts in different things, but then they have the opportunity by being in the university to trade with each other, whereas if they were on their own, they would have to learn a little bit of everything and not be as good. Yeah, Mike.
This isn't like really worded well. but
Yeah.
Are there cases where this kind of specialization keeps people from like having better, like, so if Japan produces a lot of like hardware for things like, I assume like computers, because yours are going.
Yeah.
But then Apple does something like design a completely new like way of putting together a laptop or something, and then they like sell a bunch. Are there examples of that?
You're saying when like integrating the hardware and the software can be important to innovation, and therefore places that are specialized might be hard. Is that sort of what you're suggesting, Mike?
Or maybe that like that kind of specialization, like what if there's somebody in the U.S. who's like really good at producing or like who has a really good hardware idea, but it would like be harder for them to do it in that culture of producing software, right? Maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a case in which that pushes against this idea that there could be these economies of scale. These things all depend on economies of scale, like it's better to specialize than to diversify. And that is true, certainly for many things, but it's not true for everything. And one reason it might not be true is that people just might have creative ideas in different areas, and if you force them to specialize, they may be unable to manifest all their creativity. I guess my feeling is like, it's actually, there's another level of specialization, which is that some areas specialize in being specialized, and some areas specialize in being general. You know what I mean? And it's only because a lot of the gains from specialization come precisely because there's people who are specialized in bridging between the specializations. Okay. So talented individuals can reach a bigger audience is another reason why trade can be useful. So this is a little bit like comparative advantage, but it's not really an issue of you focusing on something. It's exploiting natural differences in ability. If you allow the absolute best people at any given thing to reach the whole world rather than just serving their country, which trade allows you to do, you can reap a lot of gains from that. And there's actually lots of other stories about why trade brings benefits, and many of them are connected to the logic here. Okay, so that's the basics of trade. Now I want to talk about comparative statics of an equilibrium. So what happens if there is a rise in supply of a good or a subsidy given to the producers of a good? Andrew, what should we expect to happen to price and quantity?
I suppose quantity would go up, price would go down.
That's right. And this is what happens in normal supply and demand, right? So in particular, the equilibrium, if we give some increase in supply, is the increase in supply S plus the supply as a function of price and demand as a function of price. So Kim, can you derive how much price changes when this supply shifter increases using the implicit function theorem from this equation? You can do it on the board or whatever you prefer. No, don't look at your computer.
1 over t prime sp minus t prime p.
D prime SP? What?
1 over t prime.
Yeah, so it's 1 over, okay, so you implicitly differentiate, you get a 1 here, right, with respect to S. Oh, you're saying derivative of P with respect to, yeah, so it's, and then it's S prime times dP ds, is equal to d prime times dpds. So you subtract this side from that side, and you divide, and you get 1 over d prime of p star minus s prime of p star. Okay, so because of what Andrew said, we think that this should be negative, right? That the price should go down when the supply increases, right? Now, one simple way to justify that would be if demand slopes downward, this is negative, and supply slopes upward, that's positive, then we get that, right? But that's not necessary in order for this to be the case, right? So imagine that demand actually were to slope upward in price, but not as quickly as supply did. That would still lead to the right comparative static, right? And if that weren't the case, things would be really crazy, right? So imagine that demand sloped upward more quickly than supply. That would mean that if we had a price that was a little bit too high, that there would actually be greater. So if the price is a little bit too high, if there's more demand than there is supply, we usually want to raise the price. But if demand slopes upward more quickly than supply does, then raising the price makes that even worse. And then if you raise the price again, it makes it even worse, right? And it leads you to move away from that equilibrium, right? On the other hand, if demand doesn't slope up as quickly as price, that difference narrows, and therefore you converge back stably to the equilibrium, right? So let me show you a picture of this. I've reversed the axes from what they usually are. Here is a function of price is demand, and I've graphed it so that supply is sloping downward, right? So that's not the way we usually think about it. But as long as demand slopes downward more quickly than supply does, if supply increases, the price still decreases like we want it to. But on the other hand, if supply slopes downward more quickly than demand does, then when supply increases, the price actually has to increase, right? And the reason why that's crazy is that, here, if we have demand being greater than supply, we want to raise the price, and that makes demand and supply closer together. But here, if demand is greater than supply and we raise the price, that makes them further apart. So we're getting further and further from an equilibrium as we make the adjustments that we think. Yeah, Tanner?
Under what situations would you get a demand curve that slopes upward?
Well, you could get a demand curve sloping upward if it was a Giffen good, for example.
But doesn't that not exist?
Not very often. No. So in reality, this isn't too much of a problem, but the basic principle here applies not just to competitive equilibria, but also to game theoretic situations where you can have equilibria that sort of cross in the wrong way each other, and those are not stable. And so one way, you might have many equilibria, but many of them might be unstable, and there might be only one or two stable equilibria, and that allows you to refine down the set of things that you look at. Okay, so more generally, in any equilibrium situation, you should check to make sure that things cross in the right direction. If they don't, things are not stable. And an equilibrium that's not stable is really just like a local minimum in a maximization problem. It satisfies the first order equilibrium conditions, but it doesn't satisfy the second order conditions about whether that's actually a place where you would expect things to sit. So one of the 24210 problem sets has you look at this a little bit, and I might have asked you in some of your problem sets a question related to it. So hopefully you guys will look into it in the context of a game theoretic situation as well. Okay, so just as with trade, with production, all equilibria are going to be efficient. Because now the production possibilities are also going to be tangent. So before we said all the marginal rates of substitution equal to one another, now all the marginal rates of transformation of different firms are going to be set equal to those marginal rates of substitution. Everything is going to be made tangent by the ratio of the prices. Yeah, Philip?
If the demand function slopes upward due to a network effect, is it possible to maintain do have stability maintained even if the curves cross in the wrong direction?
Those upward sloping, okay, so first of all, network goods are almost never a competitive market. So they're almost always controlled by a monopoly. And a monopolist will never choose to produce in the part of the demand curve where demand slopes upward, because he can reduce the quantity, so he can increase the quantity and get a higher price. So he's always going to do that. So you'll never end up in that part of the demand curve, because network goods aren't controlled in the competitive market. They have too large economies of scale for that to happen. Okay, so production is really no different from consumption, and we get the same conclusion, the first fundamental welfare theorem. All market allocations are proto-optimal. Again, this is just another version of the invisible hand. But these concepts of markets are not just used in standard situations that we consider to be markets, but also in various non-market situations. So Al, what are some situations where market is used or could be used that aren't like traditional economic settings? Can you think of any?
Where the market can be used
as an allocation mechanism in something that's not like standard economic environment.
Okay. And like you mean an environment that like isn't currently?
Well, yeah, you wouldn't currently think of as being a market.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just give me a moment. Okay, so I'm gonna give a shot at it.
Yeah.
This is kind of
Yeah.
weird. So currently there's like no market for organ donations because it just prohibits that.
Yeah.
But if certain people maybe have like two lungs, and you don't need two lungs, you only need one. This is a fact. Okay. And so certain people only need one kidney. It may make sense to trade.
Yeah. So one even more controversial example is marriage. So if you think about marriage or like dating or whatever, you can sort of think of every, imagine we're in a heterosexual world, which I don't necessarily think we are, but imagine we were in a heterosexual world. In some sense, every man has some price, which is like how attractive they are. And there's like every woman has some price, which is how attractive she is according to like many different metrics. And in some sense, there's competition. You're not going to get matched to someone who's less good than you because you could do better than that. And she's not going to get matched to someone who's less good than her because she could do better than that. And through that sort of competitive dynamics, you get something that's very similar to a market going on there. And there's some papers by Gale and Shapley and Becker about that. And the mechanisms that come out of those ways of running those markets have been used, as Suel mentioned, to design markets for kidneys without using money officially, but using basically a competitive mechanism, and to match medical students to their schools. So the medical students submit ordering of all the schools that they'd like to get into, and there's a competitive process where there's prices that move around to determine whether people get in or not. I don't know if anyone knows about, has anyone heard about the medical match? Yeah.
Isn't that for residents?
For residents.
You got a Nobel Prize for that, right?
Yeah, you got a Nobel Prize for that. And basically the way that it works is everyone submits, like, this is the school I'd most like to get into, this is the next one, etc. And all the schools say, here's the resident we'd most like to get, the one we'd next most like to get, etc. And then what happens is that there's sort of like a minimum spot you need to be at on the ranking of the school in order to get in. That's like the market price for that school. And all those things for the different schools move around until supply equals demand. So it's like a market. Yeah, Philip?
In that type of system, the first welfare theorem does not ensure that the resulting allocation is optimal, right?
Well, it does ensure that it is Pareto efficient within that system. So it makes sure that there's no way you could make everyone better off.
Does that include someone lying about their preferences?
People,
Or people forced to be truthful
so
for
people,
preferences?
only one side of the market will have an incentive to be truthful. So usually the students, the way it's set up, will have an incentive to be truthful, but the hospitals won't have an incentive to be truthful. they'll have an incentive to try to basically reduce the number of students they get so that they can get some students to get admitted to other places so that the students they prefer get rejected from those other places and come back to them. So it's not generally true that you...
Is there anything that determines which side that has an incentive to be truthful? Because I've heard in students applying to like K-12 charter schools, like the students can sometimes do well by lying.
Yeah, so this mechanism is called a stable matching mechanism, and there are two different types of stable matching mechanism. One is where like you try to respect the students' preferences as much as possible. Another one is where you try to respect the hospital's preferences as much as possible. And when you respect the students' preferences as much as possible, they have an incentive to be truthful, but the hospitals have an incentive to game the system, and vice versa. Now, if there's a very large number of hospitals and a very large number of students, then both have an incentive to be truthful. It's very much the same way that in a competitive market, everyone will act as price takers if they're all small relative to the market as a whole.
So basically, if someone's preferences aren't fully respected, they will have an incentive to lie.
Yeah. Okay, so a second application is the allocation of courses. So this has been a recent popular application. So you're probably aggravated by course signups, and Eric Budish proposed a mechanism where you would submit your preferences in courses, and then you would be given some budget. But then the computer would like go through and create a market equilibrium so that supply, equals demand, and everyone gets the best that they can given the income they've been allocated, which leads to things that are both fair and efficient. Efficient in the sense that no one could be better off by exchanging their courses without making someone else worse off, and fair in the sense that nobody wishes they could be anybody else. No one prefers anybody else's allocation. Yeah, Austin.
Doesn't Booth do something like this?
Not exactly. They do something somewhat related, but not exactly the same, because in Booth you have like an auction that's like a sealed bid auction at one moment, and you could be left holding a bunch of fake currency that's worth nothing to you, right? Whereas under Eric's system, all your currency gets used up because the prices are sort of like gradually adjusting over time, and you'll never end up like just missing all your courses by $1 or something like that. Okay. So perhaps in the future, you could run artificial markets for delegated financial investing. So good investing is really complicated for human beings, but it's very easy for computers. It's like a big optimization problem. So imagine you told the computer all the circumstances of your life, your what risks you were exposed to, and rather than having money and buying mutual funds yourself, you just had all your money invested in the optimal mix of financial securities for you to be holding. And anytime I bought something from you, it just drew down my holdings a little bit, transferred them over to you, and the market in real time re-equilibrated the prices so that everyone could hold whatever they wanted to do. That's sort of like what happens in an idealized model of a market, but I think someday computers will be able to make that happen in reality. Yeah, Philip.
If computers are so good at doing investing, why isn't there a bunch of computer programs you can download and have them do your investing for you?
Because I think a lot of people think they're better at investing than they are, and so it's hard to convince people of that.
A lot of people do invest with like mutual funds and etc. So they do pay other people to invest.
Because they think that other people are better at investing than other people really are. I mean, I think people don't recognize the fact that it's like, why do people want to have a doctor advise them about their health rather than a computer? They think, oh, it's nice to have a doctor, right? But the doctors have almost no data points compared to the amount that you could have if you put all the data together. So the second fundamental welfare theorem also still holds with production. So any Pareto-optimal allocation can be achieved by the market. You just need to redistribute the right amount of money. And this leads economists to believe that we should generally try to avoid price interventions, that we should try to redistribute money directly and then allow the market to operate. Now, in practice, this is impossible. Is Victor here? Victor? No. Anyone else want to talk about why it's impossible in practice to implement this idea behind the second fundamental welfare theorem? Adam, yeah.
Well, in the reading it said something like, taking like a fixed amount of money from people is more difficult because, yeah, if you just do a tax, then it can disincentivize behavior. So you more have to tax like potential for work,
Yeah.
potential for whatever, and that
Yep.
gets complicated and hard to compute.
Yeah, why is that hard?
Well, it's hard to know not only how much they would work, also like what would be their potential job,
Yeah.
what the potential would be.
So the money has to be redistributed independent of people's actions, so it doesn't discourage people from working. But most people have most of their wealth in their human capital rather than in physical stuff they have. And the problem is it's hard to know how much human capital people have, right? Their wages are not a good measure, and they don't, and they certainly don't capture the jobs that someone might get, right? If you require a fixed amount of money from people, and imagine they say, oh, sorry, I can't pay. What are you supposed to do? Do you throw them into the gulag? Or do you not do anything? If you don't do anything, then no one will take that threat it will not be credible, right? So what if someone is really talented but decides they want to live like a bum? Are you going to throw them in jail? What are you going to do to make sure that they actually pay that money, right? Or what if they want to do something like public service, right? Now, one exception to this was Henry George's land tax. So Henry George argued that you should tax land because its value is observable and fixed. And you wouldn't do any harm by taxing land. So this is efficient, but it was never very popular in terms of distribution because a lot of people feared that there were people who were poor but who had like their grandmother's land or something like that. And if you taxed the land, you would force them to give it up, and that could be inefficient. Okay. So in practice, the interpretation of the second welfare theorem is a little bit different. Redistribution, economists usually argue, should be as direct as possible. Taxes should fall on things like income or total consumption rather than on specific components that might distort people's decisions. So, for example, many economists even oppose capital gains taxation because this distorts whether I save or and consume tomorrow or whether I consume today. Second, redistribution should usually not affect the prices of goods. Programs shouldn't subsidize rice just because the poor consume rice. It's better to tax the rich and give to the poor rather than to subsidize rice which the poor consume, because otherwise they consume too much rice or too much fuel, etc. And many programs in developing countries that do this sort of thing are pretty misguided. They're not even particularly effective ways to distribute to the poor because the rich might actually consume more fuel than the poor do, right? And it causes a lot of overconsumption and is a very expensive way to do it. Yeah, Julian.
Isn't the problem in poor countries though that it's just hard to do that kind of redistribution because you don't have the electronic records of everyone's not paying taxes and
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm not sure that that the subsidies on commodities does a very good job either sorting people out. But one thing that might do, and this is actually what my wife's dissertation is about, is in a lot of poor countries, they allow people to steal, there's laws against stealing land or selling goods in the street, but the government doesn't really enforce those against poor people. And the reason that works well is that no rich person wants to live on stolen land or wants to sell their goods in the street because it puts them in a lot of jeopardy. And so that system is a good way of targeting to the poor the subsidies. And even when you do want to affect the prices of particular goods, it's not just because they're goods consumed by the poor or by the rich. Usually what you want to do is tax goods that are complementary with leisure, like vacations, and penalize goods which are complementary, subsidized goods that are complementary with working harder. So like education causes people to work harder. Why does that make sense? Well, that encourages people, that overcomes the fact that the tax is discouraging people from working as hard. So if we subsidize education, people might earn more money in their lifetime, and that might cause them to pay higher taxes, which will be better for the rest of society. And you might want to tax a good like heroin, or maybe even make it illegal, because when people start taking heroin, they stop working. So like one broader reason why you can think that we have laws against drugs, all these sort of paternalistic things, is that the government really has an interest in seeing you not be lazy. Because if you're lazy, then it doesn't earn as much tax revenue off of you. Okay. So you guys probably learned in 200 the pro-market interpretations of the fundamental welfare theorems. You know, the usual rhetoric is that the market does everything efficiently, so leave it alone. But this isn't how these theorems have always been seen. And many socialists argued something very different. So Tanner, do you remember from the Hayek piece what socialists argued about the fundamental welfare theorems?
They said that since the efficiency doesn't matter if it's centrally planned or not, in order to get the perfect distribution or the optimal distribution of wealth, the government, some centrally planned authority, should just distribute, organize the economy.
Exactly. So they argued that a planner can just implement the relevant conditions. So there's no, that you can call them prices or whatever, but you can also just say they're Lagrange multipliers in some computer's optimization program, right? And markets in practice suffer from lots of imperfections, market powers, externalities, public goods, mistakes by consumers, just like poor distribution of wealth, and we're going to study those things throughout the rest of the course. And that therefore socialism would really implement the true market economy by doing the optimization perfectly. And that the welfare theorems are really warnings against stupid local deviations from free markets, not in any way saying that we should have a private determination of the allocation rather than a centralized one. I mean, think of all the non-market applications I gave earlier. In all those cases, you were having some computer do some big computation. You weren't actually having people interacting in a market, and those were implementing the same thing that a market does, right? So there's no reason why we actually need to have some free market capitalist system. So what that says is that the welfare theorems actually don't favor capitalism in any significant sense. So if that's not what's good about markets, Maury, what did Hayek argue really was the benefit of markets over socialism?
You don't need the central planner to have all the information. Like, you can just keep them in the minds of the consumers and they can make their own decisions. Exactly.
So this was argued by von Mises and more famously by Hayek. So the planner, in order to make these decisions, needs all of the information, but it's really hard for them to get that information without prices. So for example, imagine that you're a planner and you're trying to build a railroad. Should you, you've got a choice, there's a mountain coming up. You could go around the mountain, which will take more materials, or you could go through the mountain, which will take a lot more manpower, but less materials, right? And will also let the train get there faster. How do you trade those things off? Well, in a capitalist system, you'd say, well, how much do people value their time? What's the wage rate? That's how much time we save. How much is the cost of the materials? Well, that depends on the price of the materials, et cetera, et cetera. But without prices, it's really hard to do a lot of those things. How do you get that information without market prices, right? Well, you'd need to do some huge calculation. You'd have to have a computer constantly running, determining what the prices of everything should be, what all the opportunity costs of things are. And that computer would need information about all the different markets. But in the capitalist system, everyone only needs to think about how they interact with the prices that are relevant to them. And they can bring the little pieces of information they have about the way that the market is working to bear on those prices. And then the whole social system can compute all of these prices in an equilibrium. Otherwise, you'd have to have some gigantic computer, and you'd have to get people to reveal all their information into that system, right? The market, in this view, is fundamentally an information aggregator. It's something that puts together all the information from different people in society to form an estimate of these Lagrange multipliers, these prices. So a classic example of this is the story that nobody knows how to make a pencil. Somebody knows how to mine the graphite, and somebody else knows how to chop down the trees. And somebody else knows how to cut the trees into, the shape for the pencil, and someone else knows how to attach it to the graphite, et cetera, et cetera. But no one actually understands all the steps. And what the market does is allow all those subdivided information to be aggregated up. Another story I really like about this is, how many of you guys have seen Skyfall, the relatively new James Bond movie? So in Skyfall, Q, who's like the tech guy, who's like a nerdy young guy, meets with Bond, and he says to him, I could do more damage by noon sitting in my pajamas on my computer than you could do during a year in the field. And then Bond says, well, why don't you fire me then? And they said, well, occasionally we need someone to pull a trigger. And Bond says, or not. It's hard to know when you're sitting in your pajamas, right? So the point is that there's information that people on the ground can have that even the most brilliant centralized authority would have a hard time gathering. Okay. So, yeah, go ahead.
Have there been attempts to maybe on a small scale to I don't know, govern interaction between people through computer simulation of
Well, that's exactly what the course allocation system was doing, right? It was having people report their preferences, and then it was just having the computer assign people to courses. Yeah, Dake.
Well, along that lines, wasn't there a system in Chile in the 70s before Pinochet overthrew them that tried to use computers to do exactly that, but then they were...
I didn't know about that, but that's interesting.
It's really...
There's a famous paper by Oscar Longa, which is related to what we're going to talk about in 1 second, called The Computer and the Market. And it's about how the computer might eventually replace the market as a way of processing information. We'll talk about that in a second. So if market failures are the main cost of markets, their main benefit is delegation. If individuals have information that the government doesn't, there's a value in allowing the market to function despite its flaws because it incorporates information. So for example, if we knew everyone's potential income, well, we could just charge them that. But because we don't have all that information, we have to leave some inequality in order to give people an incentive to work harder, because we can't just redistribute all their income, right? So each according to his ability and to each according to his need is impossible to implement unless we know exactly what everybody's abilities are, right? Regulation of markets can help keep prices near marginal cost, which we know is efficient. But you can't impose it unless you know exactly what companies' costs are. Patents also raise prices above cost. And it would be a lot better if we could just give companies prizes for however much value their thing created, so we didn't have to have patents to raise their price higher. But in order to do that, we need to know how valuable the products that were created independent of the price they could get in the market, right? Another example is how much information to give consumers. So it's really confusing for people to use websites that require them to fill out long forms, or to get a whole deluge of disclosures every time you sign a credit card statement, right? You can't make any sense of that stuff. And that wouldn't be necessary if we knew everything about what would be the best financial contract for you to choose. Then a computer could just assign it to you. We wouldn't have to have you do all that processing, right? So depending on how much information is available to the consumer about what's good for them, we can reduce the burden on them in terms of reading through all this stuff or filling out lots of forms, right? So, do you have a question, Philip?
Yeah, I was thinking that wasn't use of market prices actually suggested as a mechanism for determining the correct value of which to buy out patents and put them in the public domain?
That's right. So that's an example of how you might need the market operating at least to some extent because it's precisely what provides the information to the government to make the decisions. So, and in fact, when we study benefit cost analysis, there's going to be lots of analysis that relies on market prices in order to determine how much benefits and costs of things are. But as we get better and better information, we may have better ways of determining what those values are than even the market prices. And in fact, that's what I'm going to talk about. So market distortions mean that centralization is going to be better than decentralization absent informational problems. And as a result, capitalism is really justified by the lack of fast computers and easy access to the relevant information. So what, Austin, do you think will happen as information becomes more and more public via the internet and all the reduction in privacy that's been happening recently?
Well, we'll be looking at a shift towards basically central planning, where you have a computer and a bunch of algorithms that do things like allocate people to jobs and things like that.
And that's effectively what we've been seeing in the last few years. So the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, but it won the Long War because, and it's being implemented exactly through capitalism, right? Because Netflix now tells you what movies you want to see. Google, even before you search, tells you what information you want and tells you what ads you want and therefore what you want to buy. In the internet age, local knowledge is gradually retreating, right? And consumers actually want to give up this information because they want the computer to be able to make the best decisions for them, right? And this erodes much of the case for capitalist institutions. Decision engines increasingly make choices for us. Apple has such good information about which apps you like just based on what time you spend using them that it can reward app developers not based on the price you're willing to pay, but just based on people's use, right? So that's like an alternative to patents that Apple can basically implement, right? It's getting increasingly easier to monitor ability and income because of information technology and genetics being able to predict how well someone will do based on things that are observable, right? Consumers make bad decisions in financial markets, and there's a good case for this sort of centralization through technology that I was talking about before. So many of these changes were brought about precisely by the innovations that took place within the market, but in the end are eroding the value of those markets' institutions. So I think in the end, Marx was right that capitalism would be its own undoing, but for completely different reasons than he saw, because he didn't think about the fact that it was information that was central to the nature of capitalism, rather than capital or anything like that. Okay, so for the rest of the course, we're going to explore trade-offs along these informational dimensions. We'll see ways in which individuals and markets misbehave, but we'll also see that absent the information those individuals and markets have, it may be very hard to do planning. And the degree of optimal intervention is going to be based on a balance between these two things. Many interventions, by the way, don't really require governments per se. As we saw, Google and Netflix and so forth are acting as the central planners for large parts of the economy presently. So it's not really an issue of markets versus government. It's an issue of whether resources should be allocated in a centralized or in a decentralized manner. And these things are almost never 0-1. It's almost always in certain areas it's more strongly this way, and the costs are on net in this direction or the other. It's really a question of how much should who decide and when. And details of the situations matter for those types of questions. And the coming weeks will hopefully tune you into these and beat out of you ideological reactions to centralization and socialism versus capitalism. And I think that's really what it means to be a communist. I mean, being a and to leave you with what it means to be a communist, I will play for you a song as you leave today. Has anyone ever heard this song before?